By September 1900, the British were nominally in control of both republics, with the exception of North Transvaal. However, they discovered they only controlled the territory their columns physically occupied. Despite the loss of their capitals and half their army, the Boer commanders adopted guerrilla warfare, conducting raids against railways, resource and supply targets, aimed at disrupting the operational capacity of the British Army. They avoided pitched battles and casualties were light. Boer commando units were sent to the district from which its members were recruited, which meant they could rely on local support and knowledge of the terrain and towns, enabling them to live off the land. Their orders were simply to act against the British whenever possible. Their tactics were to strike fast, causing as much damage as possible, then withdraw before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The vast distances of the republics allowed Boer commandos freedom to move about, and made it nearly impossible for the 250,000 British troops to control the territory effectively using columns alone. As soon as a British column left a town or district, British control of that area faded away. Boer commandos were especially effective during the initial guerrilla phase, because Roberts had assumed the war would end with the capture of the capitals and dispersal of the Boer armies. British troops were therefore redeployed out of the area, and had been replaced by lower-quality Imperial yeomanry and locally raised irregular corps. Playbill for an illustrated lecture on the campaign by war correspondent and artist Rene Bull, 1900. From late May 1900, the first successes of the Boer guerrilla strategy were at Lindley, where 500 yeomanry surrendered, and at Heilbronn, where a large convoy and its escort were captured, and other skirmishes resulting in 1,500 British casualties in less than 10 days. In December 1900, de la Rey and Christian Beyers attacked and mauled a British brigade at Nieuwitgedacht, inflicting 650 casualties. As a result, the British, led by Lord Kitchener, mounted extensive searches for Christian de Wet, but without success. However, Boer raids on British Army camps and other targets were sporadic and poorly planned, and the nature of the Boer guerrilla war itself had no long-term objectives, with the exception to harass the British. This led to a disorganized pattern of scattered engagements between the British and Boers. Use of blockhouses. The British were forced to revise their tactics. They concentrated on restricting the freedom of movement of the Boer commandos and depriving them of local support. The railway lines had provided vital lines of communication and supply, and as the British had advanced across South Africa, they had used armored trains and established fortified blockhouses at key points along most lines. 72. They built additional blockhouses, each housing between 6 to 8 soldiers under a non-commissioned officer, at bridges and beside major roads connecting rural towns, and fortified these to protect supply routes against Boer raiders. Eventually, over 8,000 such blockhouses were built across the republics, radiating from the larger towns along principal roads and railways. Each blockhouse cost £800 and took 3 months to build. Despite this, they proved effective. Not one bridge or any section of railway line at which a blockhouse was manned was blown up. 72. The blockhouse system required many troops to garrison. Well over 50,000 British troops, or 50 battalions, were involved in blockhouse duty, greater than the approximately 30,000 Boers in the field during the guerrilla phase. In addition, up to 16,000 local Africans were used as armed guards and to patrol the line at night. 72. The Army linked the blockhouses with barbed wire fences to parcel up the wide veldt into smaller areas. New model drives were mounted under which a line of troops could sweep an area of veldt bounded by blockhouse lines, unlike the earlier inefficient scouring of the countryside by scattered columns. Scorched-earth campaign against civilians. A British response to the guerrilla war was a scorched-earth policy to deny guerrillas supplies and refuge. Here Boer civilians watch their house as it is burned. The British implemented a scorched-earth policy under which they targeted everything within the controlled areas that could give sustenance to the guerrillas, making it harder for them to survive. As British troops swept the countryside, they systematically destroyed crops, poisoned wells, burned homesteads and farms, and interned Boer and African men, women, children, and workers in concentration camps. The British established mounted raiding columns in support of sweeper columns. These were used to rapidly follow and relentlessly harass the Boers to delay them and cut off escape, while the sweeper units caught up. Many of the 90 or so mobile columns formed by the British to participate in such drives were a mixture of British and colonial troops, but they also had a large minority of armed Africans. The number of armed Africans serving with these columns has been estimated at 20,000. Citation needed. The British Army made use of Boer auxiliaries who had been persuaded to change sides and enlist as National Scouts. Serving under General Andries Krige, 1849–1923, the National Scouts were despised as joiners but numbered a fifth of the fighting Afrikaners by the end of the war, 73. The British utilized armored trains to deliver rapid reaction forces much more quickly to incidents, such as Boer attacks on blockhouses and columns, or dropped them off ahead of retreating Boer columns. Peace committees. Among those burghers who had stopped fighting, it was decided to form peace committees to persuade those fighting to desist. In December 1900, Lord Kitchener gave permission that a Central Burgher Peace Committee be inaugurated in Pretoria. By the end of 1900, 30 envoys were sent out to the districts to form peace committees to persuade burghers to give up. Previous leaders of the Boers, like Generals Piet de Wet and Andries Krige, were involved in the organization. Mayor de Kock was an emissary of a peace committee, but he was arrested, convicted of high treason, and executed by firing squad, 74. Joiners. Some burghers joined the British in their fight against the Boers. By the end of hostilities in May 1902, there were 5,464 burghers working for the British, 75. Orange Free State. Christian de Wet was the most formidable leader of the Boer guerrillas. He successfully evaded capture several times and later involved in the negotiations for a peace settlement. After having conferred with the Transvaal leaders, de Wet returned to the Orange Free State, where he inspired successful attacks and raids in the western part of the country, though he suffered a defeat at Bothaville in November 1900. Many Boers who had returned to their farms and towns, sometimes after being given parole by the British, took up arms again. In late January 1901, de Wet led a renewed invasion of Cape Colony. This was less successful because there was no general uprising among the Cape Boers, and de Wet's men were hampered by bad weather and pursued by British forces. They narrowly escaped across the Orange River. From then until the final days of the war, de Wet remained comparatively quiet, rarely attacking British Army camps and columns, partly because the Orange Free State was effectively left desolate by British sweeps. In December 1901, de Wet attacked and overran an isolated British detachment at Groenkoop, inflicting heavy casualties and capturing over 200 British soldiers. This prompted Kitchener to launch the first of the new model drives against him. De Wet escaped the first such drive but lost 300 fighters. This was a severe loss and a portent of further attrition, although sweep attempts to round up de Wet were badly handled and de Wet's forces avoided capture. Western Transvaal. The Boer commandos in the Western Transvaal were very active after September 1901. Several battles were fought there between September 1901 and March 1902. At Modewil on 30 September 1901, and again at Driefontein on 24 October, General Coos de la Rey's forces attacked British camps and outposts, but were forced to withdraw after the British offered strong resistance. From late 1901 to early 1902, a time of relative quiet descended on the Western Transvaal. February 1902 saw the next major battle in that region. On 25 February, de la Rey attacked a British column under Lieutenant Colonel S.B. von Donop at Ustersproot near Walmeranstad. De la Rey succeeded in capturing many men and ammunition. The Boer attacks prompted Lord Methuen, the British second-in-command after Kitchener, to move his column from Vryburg to Klerksdorp to deal with de la Rey. On the morning of 7 March 1902, the Boers attacked the rear guard of Methuen's moving column at Tweebosch. Confusion reigned in British ranks, and Methuen was wounded and captured by the Boers. The Boer victories in the west led to stronger action by the British. In the second half of March 1902, British reinforcements were sent to the western Transvaal under the direction of Ian Hamilton. The opportunity the British were waiting for arose on 11 April 1902 at Rooiwal, where a commando led by General Jan Kemp and Commandant Potgieter attacked a superior force under Kekwich. The British soldiers were well positioned on the hillside and inflicted casualties on the Boers charging on horseback over a large distance, beating them back. This was the end of the war in the western Transvaal and the last major battle of the war. Eastern Transvaal. Boer Commandos c. 1900. Two Boer forces fought in this area, under Botha in the southeast and under Ben Viljoen in the northeast around Lydenburg. Botha's forces were particularly active, raiding railways and British supply convoys, and mounting a renewed invasion of Natal in September 1901. After defeating British mounted infantry in the Battle of Blood River Port near Dundee, Botha was forced to withdraw by heavy rain that made movement difficult and crippled his horses. Back on the Transvaal territory around his home district of Vryheid, Botha attacked a British raiding column at Baconlocht, using an effective mounted charge. One of the most active British units was effectively destroyed. This made Botha's forces the target of increasingly large scorched-earth drives by British forces, in which the British made particular use of native scouts and informers. Eventually, Botha had to abandon the high veld and retreat to a narrow enclave bordering Swaziland. To the north, Ben Viljoen grew steadily less active. His forces mounted comparatively few attacks, and as a result, the Boer enclave around Lydenburg was largely unmolested. Viljoen was eventually captured. Cape Colony. In parts of Cape Colony, particularly the Cape Midlands district where Boers formed a majority of the white inhabitants, the British had always feared a general uprising against them. In fact, no such uprising took place, even in the early days of the war when Boer armies had advanced across the Orange. The cautious conduct of some elderly Orange Free State generals had been one factor that discouraged the Cape Boers from siding with the Boer republics. Nevertheless, there was widespread pro-Boer sympathy. Some Cape Dutch volunteered to help the British, but a larger number volunteered to help the other side. Politics was more important than the military factor. The Cape Dutch, according to Milner 90% of whom favored the rebels, controlled the provincial legislature, and its authorities forbade the British Army to burn farms or to force Boer civilians into concentration camps. 76. The British had more limited options to suppress the insurgency in the Cape Colony as a result. After he escaped across the Orange in March 1901, De Wet had left forces under Cape rebels Kritzinger and Gideon Scheepers to maintain a guerrilla campaign in the Cape Midlands. The campaign here was one of the least chivalrous of the war, with intimidation by both sides of each other's civilian sympathizers. In one of many skirmishes, Commandant Johannes Lerter's small commando was tracked down by a much superior British column and wiped out at Groenkloof. Several captured Boers, including Lotter and Scheepers, who was captured when he fell ill with appendicitis, were executed by the British for treason or for capital crimes such as the murder of British prisoners or unarmed civilians. Some of the executions took place in public to deter further disaffection. Fresh Boer forces under Jan Christian Smuts, joined by the surviving rebels under Kritzinger, made another attack on the Cape in September 1901. They suffered severe hardships and were hard pressed by British columns, but eventually rescued themselves by routing some of their pursuers at the Battle of Eland's River and capturing their equipment. From then until the end of the war, Smuts increased his forces from among Cape rebels until they numbered 3,000. However, no general uprising took place, and the situation in the Cape remained stalemated. In January 1902, Boer leader Manny Maritz was implicated in the Leliefontein massacre in the far northern Cape. Boer Foreign Volunteers. Main article: Boer Foreign Volunteers. While no other government actively supported the Boer cause, individuals from several countries volunteered and formed foreign volunteer units. These primarily came from Europe, particularly the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden-Norway. Other countries such as France, Italy, Ireland, then part of the United Kingdom, and restive areas of the Russian Empire, including Congress, Poland, and Georgia, also formed smaller volunteer corps. Finns fought in the Scandinavian Corps. 2 volunteers, George Henry Anne-Marie Victor de Villebois-Meruel of France and Yevgeny Maximov of Russia, became Wegenerals, fighting generals of the South African Republic. 77. Conclusion. Peace Conference at Vereeniging. Transvaal War. Queen Victoria on her throne among Commonwealth subjects in front of London. First British magic lantern slide in an educational series for children, 1900s. In early 1902, British tactics of containment, denial, and harassment finally began to yield results against the guerrillas. The sourcing and coordination of intelligence became increasingly efficient with regular reporting from observers in the blockhouses, from units patrolling the fences and conducting sweeper operations, and from native Africans in rural areas who increasingly supplied intelligence. As the scorched-earth policy took effect, and they found themselves competing with the Boers for food supplies. Kitchener's forces at last began to affect the Boers' fighting strength and freedom of maneuver, and made it harder for the Boers and their families to survive. Despite this success, almost half the Boer fighting strength, around 15,000 men, were still in the field fighting by May 1902. However, Kitchener's tactics were costly. Britain was running out of time, patience, and money needed for the war. 78. The British offered terms of peace on various occasions, notably in March 1901, but were rejected by Botha and the bitterenders among the Boers, who pledged to fight until the bitter end and rejected the demand for compromise made by the hands-uppers. Their reasons included hatred of the British, loyalty to their dead comrades, solidarity with fellow commandos, a desire for independence, religious arguments, and fear of captivity or punishment. On the other hand, their women and children were dying in prison camps, and independence seemed more and more impossible. 79. The last of the Boers finally surrendered in May 1902, and the war ended with the Treaty of Vereeniging signed on 31 May 1902. After a period of obstinacy, the British offered the Boers generous terms of conditional surrender in order to bring the war to a conclusion. The Boers were given £3 million for reconstruction and promised eventual limited self-government, which was granted in 1906 and 1907. The treaty ended the existence of the Transvaal and Orange Free State as independent Boer republics and placed them within the British Empire. The Union of South Africa was established as a dominion of the British Empire in 1910. Non-white roles. The policy on both sides was to minimize the role of non-whites, but the need for manpower continuously stretched those resolves. At the Battle of Spion Kop in Ladysmith, Mohandas K. Gandhi with 300 Free Burgher Indians and 800 indentured Indian laborers started the ambulance corps serving the British side. As the war raged across African farms and their homes were destroyed, many became refugees, and they, like the Boers, moved to the towns where the British hastily created internment camps. Subsequently, the British scorched-earth policies were applied to both Boers and Africans. Although most black Africans were not considered by the British to be hostile, Many tens of thousands were also forcibly removed from Boer areas and also placed in concentration camps. Citation needed. Africans were held separately from Boer internees. Citation needed. Eventually, there were a total of 64 tented camps for Africans. Conditions were as bad as in the camps for the Boers, but even though, after the Fawcett Commission report, conditions improved in the Boer camps, improvements were much slower in coming to the black camps. 20,000 died there, 80. The Boers and the British both feared the consequences of arming Africans. The memories of the Zulu and other tribal conflicts were still fresh, and they recognized that whoever won would have to deal with the consequences of a mass militarization of the tribes. There was therefore an unwritten agreement that this war would be a white man's war. Citation needed. At the outset, British officials instructed all white magistrates in the natal colony to appeal to Zulu Amakosi chiefs to remain neutral, and President Kruger sent emissaries asking them to stay out of it. However, in some cases there were old scores to be settled, and some Africans, such as the Swazis, were eager to enter the war with the specific aim of reclaiming land won by the Boers. Citation needed. As the war went on, there was greater involvement of Africans, and in particular, large numbers became embroiled in the conflict on the British side, either voluntarily or involuntarily. By the end of the war, many Africans had been armed and had shown conspicuous gallantry in roles such as scouts, messengers, watchmen in blockhouses, and auxiliaries. Citation needed. Saul Plott, who kept a diary during the siege of Mafeking. And there were more flash points outside of the war. On 6 May 1902 at Hallkrantz in the southeastern Transvaal, a Zulu faction had their cattle stolen and their women and children tortured by the Boers as a punishment for assisting the British. The local Boer officer then sent an insulting message to the tribe, challenging them to take back their cattle. The Zulus attacked at night, and in a mutual bloodbath, the Boers lost 56 killed and 3 wounded, while the Africans suffered 52 killed and 48 wounded. 601. About 10,000 black men were attached to Boer units where they performed camp duties. A handful unofficially fought in combat. The British Army employed over 14,000 Africans as wagon drivers. Even more had combatant roles as spies, guides, and eventually as soldiers. By 1902, there were about 30,000 armed Africans in the British Army. 81. Saul Plott was the only black person to keep a diary during the war, which later proved to be a valuable source about the black participation in the war. 82-83. Concentration camps. Main articles. Second Boer War concentration camps and British war crimes section, South Africa. Tents in the Bloemfontein concentration camp. The term concentration camp was used to describe camps operated by the British in South Africa during this conflict in the years 1900–02, and the term grew in prominence during this period. The camps had originally been set up by the British Army as refugee camps to provide refuge for civilian families who had been forced to abandon their homes for whatever reason related to the war. However, when Kitchener took over in late 1900, he introduced new tactics in an attempt to break the guerrilla campaign, and the influx of civilians grew dramatically as a result. Disease and starvation killed thousands. 1784–85, Kitchener initiated plans to flush out guerrillas in a series of systematic drives, organized like a sporting shoot, with success defined in a weekly bag of killed, captured, and wounded, and to sweep the country bare of everything that could give sustenance to the guerrillas, including women and children. It was the clearance of civilians, uprooting a whole nation, that would come to dominate the last phase of the war. Pakenham, the Boer War 16, 493. Lizzie Van Zyl, a Boer child, age 7, photographed by Emily Hobhouse in a British concentration camp near Bloemfontein, February 1901. Native Africans interned in the Bronkhorstspruit camp. as Boer farms were destroyed by the British under their scorched earth policy, including the systematic destruction of crops and slaughtering of livestock, the burning down of homesteads and farms. To prevent the Boers from resupplying from a home base, many tens of thousands of women and children were forcibly moved into the concentration camps. This was not the first appearance of internment camps, as the Spanish had used internment in Cuba in the 10 Years' War, and the Americans in the Philippine American War, 86. But the Boer War concentration camp system was the first time that a whole nation had been systematically targeted, and the first in which whole regions had been depopulated. Eventually, there were a total of 45 tented camps built for Boer internees and 64 for black Africans. Of the 28,000 Boer men captured as prisoners of war, 25,630 were sent overseas to prisoner-of-war camps throughout the British Empire. The vast majority of Boers remaining in the local camps were women and children. Around 26,370 Boer women and children were to perish in these concentration camps. 87 of the more than 120,000 blacks and coloreds imprisoned too, around 20,000 died. 88-85-89. The camps were poorly administered from the outset and became increasingly overcrowded when Kitchener's troops implemented the internment strategy on a vast scale. Conditions were terrible for the health of the internees, mainly due to neglect, poor hygiene, and bad sanitation. The supply of all items was unreliable, partly because of the constant disruption of communication lines by the Boers. The food rations were meager, and there was a two-tier allocation policy, whereby families of men who were still fighting were routinely given smaller rations than others. 505. The inadequate shelter, poor diet, bad hygiene, and overcrowding led to malnutrition and endemic contagious diseases such as measles, typhoid, and dysentery, to which the children were particularly vulnerable. 90. Coupled with a shortage of modern medical facilities, many of the internees died. While much of the British press, including the Times, played down the problems in the camps, Emily Hobhouse helped raise public awareness in Britain of the atrocious conditions, as well as being instrumental in bringing relief to the concentration camps. 91. War Crimes Trial. Main articles: British War Crimes Section, South Africa, and Court-Martial of Breaker Morant. The Boer War saw the first war crimes prosecutions in British history. They centered around the Bushveld Carbineers, BVC, a British Army irregular regiment of mounted rifles active in the northern Transvaal. Originally raised in February 1901, the BVC was composed of British and Commonwealth servicemen with an admixture of defectors from the Boer commandos. 92. On 4 October 1901, a letter signed by 15 members of the Bushveld Carbineers, BVC, garrison at Fort Edward was secretly dispatched to Carl F. H. Hall, the British Army officer commanding at Pietersburg. Written by BVC trooper Robert Mitchell Cochrane, a former Justice of the Peace from Western Australia, 93-94, the letter accused members of the Fort Edward garrison of 6 disgraceful incidents: the shooting of 6 surrendered Afrikaner men and boys and theft of their money and livestock at Valdezia on 2 July 1901. The orders were given by Captains Alfred Taylor and James Huntley Robertson and relayed by SGT Madge KCB Morrison to SGT DC Oldham. The actual killing was alleged to have been carried out by SGT Oldham and BVC troopers Eden, Arnold, Brown, Heath, and Dale, 95. The shooting of BVC trooper B.J. Van Buren by BVC LT Peter Hancock on 4 July. Trooper Van Buren, an Afrikaner, had disapproved of the killings at Valdezia and informed the victims' wives and children, imprisoned at Fort Edward, of what had happened. 96. The revenge killing of Floris Visser, a wounded prisoner of war, near the Kodos River on 11 August. Visser had been captured by a BVC patrol led by Lieut. Harry Morant 2 days before his death. After Visser had been exhaustively interrogated and conveyed for 15 miles by the patrol, LT, Morant had ordered his men to form a firing squad and shoot him. The squad consisted of BVC troopers A.J. Petrie, J.J. Gill, Wild, and T.J. Botha. A coup de grace was delivered by BVC LT, Harry Picton. The slaying of Visser was in retaliation for the combat death of Morant's friend, BVC Captain Percy Frederick Hunt, at Duivelskloof on 6 August, 97. The shooting, ordered by Cap Taylor and LT, Morant, of 4 surrendered Afrikaners and 4 Dutch schoolteachers who had been captured at the Elim Hospital in Valdezia on the morning of 23 August. The firing squad consisted of BVC LT, George Whitten, SGT, D.C. Oldham, and troopers J.T. Arnold, Edward Brown, T. Dale, and A. Heath. Although Trooper Cochrane's letter made no mention of the fact, 3 native South African witnesses were also shot dead. 98. The ambush and fatal shooting of the Reverend Carl August Daniel Hees of the Berlin Missionary Society near Bandelerkop on the afternoon of 23 August. Rev Hees had spiritually counseled the Dutch and Afrikaner victims that morning and angrily protested to Morant at Fort Edward upon learning of their deaths. Trooper Cochrane alleged that the killer of Hees was BVC LT, Hancock, although Cochrane made no mention that Hees's driver, a member of the Southern Ndebele people, was also killed. 99. The orders given by BVC LT, Charles H.G. Hannam, to open fire on a wagon train containing Afrikaner women and children who were coming in to surrender at Fort Edward on 5 September. The ensuing gunfire led to the deaths of 2 boys, aged 5 and 13, and the wounding of a 9-year-old. The shooting of Van and his sons and near Fort Edward on 7 September. All were coming to surrender in the hope of gaining medical treatment for who was suffering from fever. Instead, they were met at the farm near Fort Edward by a party consisting of, and joined by BVC, Corp MacMahon and troopers, and Van and both his sons were shot, allegedly after being forced to dig there. The letter then accused Field Commander of the BVC, Major Robert William, of being privy to these. It is for this reason that we have taken the liberty of addressing this communication direct to you. After listing civilian witnesses who could confirm their allegations, Trooper concluded, "Sir, many of us are Australians who have fought throughout nearly the whole war, while others are who have fought from till now. We cannot return home with the stigma of these crimes attached to our names. Therefore, we humbly pray that a full and exhaustive inquiry be made by Imperial officers, in order that the truth be elicited and justice done. Also, we beg that all witnesses may be kept in camp till the inquiry is finished. So deeply do we deplore the opprobrium which must be inseparably attached to these crimes that scarcely a man once his time is up can be prevailed to re-enlist in this corps. Trusting for the credit of thinking you will grant the inquiry we seek." In response to the letter, Carl Hall summoned all Fort Edward officers on 21 October. All were met by mounted infantry 5 miles outside on the morning of 23 October and brought into town like criminals. Was arrested after returning from leave in Pretoria, where he had gone to settle the affairs of his deceased friend Captain Major James Francis Thomas, standing over the joint grave of Breaker and Peter, officers executed after a 1902 court-martial. Although the trial transcripts, like most others between 1851–914, were later destroyed by the civil, it is known that a court of inquiry, the British military's equivalent to a grand jury, was convened on 16 October. The president of the court was Carl H.M. Carter, who was assisted by Captain E. and Major N. Bolton, the provost marshal of. Its first session took place on 6 November and continued for 4 weeks. Deliberations continued for a further 2, at which time it became clear the indictments would be as follows. In what became known as the Six Boers case, Captains and Taylor, as well as, were charged with committing the offense of murder while on active. In relation to what was dubbed the Van incident, was charged with went on active service by culpable neglect failing to make a report which it was his duty to make in relation to the incident, and were charged with, while on active service, committing the offense of, in relation to what was incorrectly dubbed the 8 Boers case, loots, and were charged with, while on active service, committing the offense of, in relation to the slaying of, and were charged with, while on active service, committing the offense of murder. No charges were filed for the 3 children who had been shot by the near fort, in relation to what became known as the 3 Boers case, and were charged with, while on active service, committing the offense of. Following the indictments, R. and Call James, Clare ordered Bolton to appear for the prosecution as he was less expensive than a. Bolton vainly requested to be excused, writing, "My knowledge of law is insufficient for so intricate a matter." The first court-martial opened on 16 January 1902 with Lute Call, H.C. presiding over a panel of 6 judges. J.F. Thomas, a solicitor from New South Wales, had been retained to defend. The night before, however, he agreed to represent all 6. The incident was the first case to go to trial. Former orderly and interpreter, BVC Trooper J. that, who had been promised his life would be spared, was cooperative during 2 days of interrogation, and his information was found to have been true. Despite this, ordered him, in response, that he only followed orders to take no prisoners as relayed to the late Captain Hunt by Col Hamilton. He alleged that was captured wearing a British Army jacket and that Hunt's body had been. In response, the court moved to Pretoria, where Col Hamilton that he had never spoken to Captain Hunt with reference to his duties in the northern Transvaal. Though stunned, Thomas argued that his clients were not guilty because they believed that they acted under orders. In response, Bolton argued that they were illegal orders and said, "The right of killing an armed man exists only so long as he resists. As soon as he submits, he is entitled to be treated as a prisoner of war." The court ruled in Bolton's, was found guilty of murder, and were convicted of the lesser charge of, on 27 February, and were executed by firing squad after being convicted of murdering 8 Afrikaner POWs. This court-martial for war crimes was one of the first such prosecutions in British history. Although left a confession in his cell, he went on to become a folk hero in modern Australia. Believed by many Australians to be the victim of a kangaroo court, appeals have been made for to be or pardoned. His court-martial and death have been the subject of books, a stage play, and Australian New Wave film adaptation. Was sentenced to death but reprieved. Due to immense political pressure, he was released after serving 32 months of a life sentence. Was. Imperial involvement. See also, British Army during the Victorian era, Second Boer War. Most troops fighting for the British Army came from Britain, and a significant number came from other parts of its empire. These countries had internal disputes over whether they should remain tied to London or have independence, which carried over into the debate around sending forces to assist the war. Though not independent on foreign affairs, these countries did have local say over how much support to provide and how it was provided. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Rhodesia all sent volunteers to aid the UK. Troops were also raised to fight with the British from the Cape Colony and Natal. Some Boer fighters, such as Smuts, were British subjects as they came from the Cape Colony and Colony of Natal. Needed. There were many volunteers from the Empire who were not selected for the official contingents and traveled privately to form private units, such as the Canadian Scouts and Australian Scouts. There were European volunteer units from British India and British Ceylon, though the British refused offers of non-white troops from the Empire. Some Cape volunteered early in the war, but later some were effectively conscripted and kept in segregated units. As a community, they received little reward for their services. The war set the pattern for the Empire's involvement in the 2 world wars. Specially raised units, consisting of volunteers, were dispatched overseas to serve with forces from elsewhere in the Empire. Australia. Main article, Australia in the Second Boer War. See also, History of the Australian Army Boer War. British and Australian officers in South Africa. From 1899 to 1901, the 6 separate self-governing colonies in Australia sent contingents to serve in the war. That much of the population had originated from Britain explains a desire to support it. After the colonies formed the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, the new government of Australia sent Commonwealth contingents to the Boer War was thus the first war in which the Commonwealth of Australia fought. A few Australians fought on the Boer. The most famous in character was Colonel Arthur Alfred Lynch, formerly of Victoria, who raised the 2nd Irish Brigade. The Australian climate and geography were far closer to that of South Africa than most other parts of the empire, so Australians adapted quickly, with troops serving mostly among the Army's mounted rifles. Enlistment in official Australian contingents totaled 463, 121. Another 5,000 to 7,000 Australians served in irregular regiments raised in South Africa. Perhaps 500 Australian irregulars were killed. In total, about 20,000 Australians served and about 1,000 were killed. 267 died from disease, 251 were killed in action or from wounds sustained in battle. 43 men were reported missing, 122. When the war began, some Australians, like some Britons, opposed it. As the war dragged on, some Australians became disenchanted, in part because of the sufferings of Boer civilians reported in the press. When the British missed capturing President Paul Kruger as he escaped Pretoria during its fall in June 1900, a Melbourne Punch cartoon depicted how the war could be won, using the Kelly Gang, 123. The convictions and executions of 2 Australian lieutenants, Harry Harbord Morant and Peter Hancock in 1902, and the imprisonment of a 3rd, George Whitten, had minimal impact on the Australian public at the time. The controversial court-martial saw the 3 convicted of executing prisoners under their authority. After the war, though, Australians joined an empire-wide campaign that saw Whitten released from jail. Much later, some Australians came to see the execution of Morant and Hancock as instances of wrongfully executed Australians, as illustrated in the 1980 Australian film Breaker Morant. Up to 50 Aboriginal Australians served in the Boer War as trackers. Such is the lack of information available, it is even uncertain as to whether they returned to Australia after the war. When the Australian contingents returned, the trackers may not have been allowed back to Australia due to the White Australia policy. 124. Canada. English Wikisource has original text related to this article. Canadian appeal for the widows and orphans of the South African War. See also, Canada in the Second Boer War. See also, Military History of Canada section Boer War. The unveiling of the South African War Memorial in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, in 1908. Around 8,000 Canadians arrived in South Africa to fight for Britain. These arrived in contingents, the first on 30 October 1899, the second on 21 January 1900. A 3rd contingent of cavalry, Strathcona's Horse, embarked on 16-17 March 1900, 125. They remained until May 1902, 126, with approximately 368 127 soldiers and 12 nurses 128 in a combat zone. The conflict became the largest engagement involving Canadian soldiers from the time of Confederation until the Great War. 126. It was also the first time since the Modest War that Canadians had been deployed overseas. 129. 270 Canadian soldiers died during the war. 126. The arrival and movement of troops was widely documented by war photographers. English-born and later Canadian, Inglise Sheldon Williams was one of the most notable, documenting movement of hundreds of troops to Africa. 130. The Canadian public was initially divided on the decision to go to war, as some did not want Canada to become Britain's tool for engaging in armed conflicts. Many Anglophone citizens were pro-Empire and wanted Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier to support the British. Many Francophone citizens felt threatened by the continuation of British imperialism to their national sovereignty. 131 in the end, to appease citizens who wanted war and avoid angering those against it. Laurier sent 1,000 volunteers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Otter to aid the Confederation in its war to liberate the peoples of the Boer-controlled states in South Africa. The volunteers were provided to the British if the latter paid costs of the battalion after it arrived in South Africa. 132. The supporters of the war claimed that it pitted British freedom, justice, and civilization against Boer backwardness. 133. The French-Canadians' opposition to the Canadian involvement in a British colonial venture eventually led to a three-day riot in Quebec. 127-134. Many Canadian soldiers did not actually see combat since many arrived around the time of the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging on 31 May 1902.